After his lectures at Cambridge, Ludwig Wittgenstein would rush to the nearest cinema and sit in the front row watching the cheapest westerns he could find. Cowboys, gunfights, nothing cerebral. He needed to drown out his own thinking. This was one of the most rigorous philosophers of the 20th century, a man who agonized over every sentence he wrote, and his relief valve was mindless movies. That tension runs through everything we're going to talk about tonight. Because Wittgenstein spent his life drawing a line between what words can do and what they can't, and he ended up on the quiet side of that line more often than you'd expect. There's a book, and it's one of the most important philosophy books of the 20th century, that ends by telling you everything it just said is nonsense. Not in a coy way, not as some postmodern wink. The author genuinely means it. He spent years constructing an intricate logical architecture, proposition by numbered proposition, building toward what he believed was the complete solution to every problem philosophy had ever posed. And then near the very end, in proposition 6.54, he compares the entire thing to a ladder. You climb it rung by rung, following his reasoning as it ascends through language and logic and the structure of reality itself. And when you finally reach the top, when you've understood what he's trying to show you, he says you have to throw the ladder away, because anyone who truly understands him will eventually recognize that all of those propositions, every single one of them, are nonsensical. The conclusions can only be true if everything said to reach them is, by the book's own logic, meaningless. That's not a flaw in the argument, that's the argument. The man who wrote this was Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the book was the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921. He was 32 years old, and he was completely serious about all of it, about the ladder, about the nonsense, about the paradox that sits like a knot at the center of the work, tightening the more you pull at it. Most books try to prove something. They lay out premises, build a case, arrive at a conclusion, and then rest on that conclusion as though it were solid ground. The Tractatus does something stranger. It lays out premises, builds a case, arrives at a conclusion, and then the conclusion dissolves the ground the whole structure was standing on. It's a book that consumes itself, a proof that proves its own foundations don't hold, and Wittgenstein didn't stumble into this. He designed it that way deliberately, knowing exactly what he was doing. Which raises a question you can turn over for a long time without settling it. Why would someone do that? Why spend years of your life, years marked by war and grief, and a kind of intellectual intensity that bordered on anguish, building something whose purpose is to demonstrate its own impossibility? Part of the answer lives in the book's final line. The Tractatus is structured around 7 primary propositions, numbered 1 through 7. Most of them branch into sub-remarks, layers of elaboration, clarification, further argument. Proposition 1 leads to 1.1, which leads to 1.11 and 1.12, and so on. The numbering system is dense, almost fractal. Some propositions have dozens of sub-remarks trailing behind them like roots spreading underground. But Proposition 7 is different. Proposition 7 has no sub-remarks, none at all. It stands completely alone, the only one of the 7 primary propositions with no elaboration whatsoever. And it says this: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That's it, that's the ending. After tens of thousands of words of rigorous logical analysis, after propositions nested inside propositions, after a system so carefully constructed it resembles a cathedral built out of pure notation, the book closes with a single sentence, and then silence. The structural choice is doing something that the words alone can't quite capture. By leaving Proposition 7 bare, by stripping it of all the elaboration that surrounds every other major claim in the book, Wittgenstein enacts the very thing he's saying. The most important idea the Tractatus has to offer, the thing the whole book has been building toward, is expressed by saying almost nothing at all. The silence after the sentence is part of the meaning. Maybe it is the meaning. And there's something almost gentle about that if you sit with it. After all the logical machinery, after the numbered propositions and the truth tables and the picture theory of language, after all of that effort and precision, the book's deepest insight is that some things simply can't be said. They can only be shown, or felt, or sat with quietly in the space where language gives out. Here's what makes this even stranger. In the preface to the Tractatus, the very first pages Wittgenstein wrote that he had, and these are his words, in essentials finally solved all the problems of philosophy. All of them. Every question that had occupied thinkers for thousands of years, from Plato to Kant to Frege, solved, finished, wrapped up. Coming from anyone else, you dismiss that as arrogance so grand it loops back around to comedy. But Wittgenstein wasn't being arrogant. Or at least not only arrogant, because in the very next breath he added something that changes the whole complexion of the claim. He said that solving all the problems of philosophy shows, and you can hear something almost sad in this, how little has been done. How little has been done. He believed he'd answered every philosophical question that could be asked, and his assessment of that achievement was that it barely mattered. That the real things, the things that actually matter to a human life, the things about meaning and value and what it feels like to be alive, those things were never touched by his solutions. They couldn't be. They lived on the other side of language, in exactly the territory that Proposition 7 gestures toward and then falls silent before. So the Tractatus is a book that solves everything and then admits the solution is almost worthless. A book that builds a perfect ladder and then insists you throw it away. A book that speaks tens of thousands of words in order to arrive at the conclusion that the most important things cannot be spoken at all. And it was written by a man who would go on to walk away from philosophy entirely after publishing it, convinced for a time that there was genuinely nothing left to say. Tonight we're going to follow that thread. We'll trace Wittgenstein's life, which was as strange and contradictory as his philosophy. We'll watch him dismantle his own ideas and rebuild them from scratch, and we'll sit with the question that haunted him from the Tractatus to the very end, the question of what happens when language reaches its limit, and whether the things waiting on the other side of that limit are the only things that ever really mattered. To understand why someone would write a book designed to destroy itself, it helps to know something about the family that produced him. The Wittgensteins were one of the wealthiest families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ludwig's father, Karl, was a steel magnate, the Andrew Carnegie of Vienna, essentially, and the family home was a center of Viennese cultural life. Brahms played in their salon. Mahler came to dinner. The children were raised in an atmosphere of extreme intellectual expectation and musical discipline, surrounded by art and money, and the particular kind of pressure that comes from being told, in 100 quiet ways, that extraordinary achievement is the minimum. There were 8 children, 5 boys, 3 girls, and of the 5 boys, 3 would die by their own hand. The first was Hans, the eldest son and reportedly the most musically gifted of all the siblings. He was a prodigy, composing music as a child, showing the kind of talent that made people in the family's circle use words like genius without hesitation. In 1902, when Hans was 26, he disappeared from a boat in Chesapeake Bay. His body was never recovered. Whether it was suicide or an accident has been debated, but the family seems to have understood it as the former. Something about the weight of all that expectation, maybe, or something else entirely. It's hard to know, at this distance, what was happening inside a young man who vanished into the water off the American coast more than a century ago. 2 years later, in 1904, it happened again. Rudi, the third brother, walked into a bar in Berlin and ordered a glass of milk. He dissolved potassium cyanide in it, drank it, and died. He was 22. He left a note, and the note referenced what he called his perverted disposition. In the language of that era, in that family, in that city, this almost certainly meant his homosexuality. Rudi had been carrying something he couldn't speak about, something the world he lived in had no room for, and in the end, the silence around it killed him. There's a grim resonance there with the philosophy his younger brother would later develop, the idea that the most important things are precisely the things that can't be said, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The family absorbed these losses and continued, the way wealthy Viennese families did, publicly composed, privately shattered. The surviving brothers grew up in the shadow of those absences. Kurt, the fourth brother, became a military officer. He served in the Austrian army during the First World War, and in 1918, during the final chaotic months of the conflict, his troops refused an order to advance. They deserted, and Kurt, whether from shame or from some deeper despair that had been building for years, or from whatever ran through the Wittgenstein brothers like a dark current, shot himself on the front lines. He was the third brother lost, 3 out of 5. Then there was Paul, the second eldest, the one who survived. Paul was a concert pianist of genuine distinction, not a prodigy playing at talent, but a serious musician with a real career. Early in the war, he was captured by the Russians, and during his imprisonment, he lost his right arm. For a pianist, that should have been the end of everything, but Paul refused to let it be. He returned to the concert stage and commissioned new works written specifically for left hand alone. Some of the most beautiful piano music of the 20th century exists because of those commissions, including a concerto by Ravel that is still performed today, a piece of astonishing delicacy and power, written for a man who had already lost half of his instrument and decided that wasn't enough to stop him. So that was the family, prodigies and suicides, extraordinary talent meeting extraordinary destruction. A household where genius was expected and despair was, apparently, endemic, and Ludwig, the youngest of the brothers, the quiet, intense one who would become the philosopher, grew up watching all of it. He nearly followed them. Throughout his life, Wittgenstein was plagued by suicidal thoughts. He spoke about it to friends, sometimes with a directness that alarmed them. The darkness that took his brothers was not something he observed from a safe distance. It was in him too, pulling at the edges. What kept him from it, and this is partly speculation, but it seems to hold, was a combination of intellectual obsession and sheer stubbornness. He needed to finish the work. The thinking wasn't done yet. And so when the war came, Wittgenstein didn't avoid it. He volunteered. He didn't have to serve. He had money, connections, every available avenue of deferment. But he enlisted anyway, and then he did something that even his fellow soldiers found alarming. He requested the most dangerous assignment available. He asked to be stationed at an observation post on the very front edge of the Austrian line, out in no man's land, the strip of open ground between the trenches where shells fell through the night, and survival was largely a matter of luck. He sat there in the dark with explosions going off around him, and he wrote philosophy. Not hastily, not as distraction, not as some romantic gesture about art in wartime. He was working through the problems of logic and language that would become the Tractatus, proposition by proposition, in a notebook he carried with him. The same numbered structure, the same rigorous architecture, the same attempt to draw the absolute boundary of what can and cannot be said, all of it being assembled while the world around him was coming apart in mud and metal. There's something almost unbearable about that image if you stay with it. A man who has watched 3 of his brothers destroy themselves, who carries the same darkness inside him, who has deliberately placed himself in the one spot on the battlefield where death is most likely, and who, instead of surrendering to any of it, is sitting in the dirt with a notebook, trying to work out the logical structure of reality. Not because he thinks it will save him, but because the work is what he has, and the alternative is silence of a kind he's not ready for yet. He completed the manuscript during military leave in the summer of 1918, near the end of the war, and then he was captured. He spent months in an Italian prisoner of war camp, and it was there, behind barbed wire, in a place designed to hold people who had lost, that he finalized the Tractatus. The book that would declare all philosophical problems solved. The book that would end with silence. When you know that history, the brothers, the bar in Berlin, the observation post in no man's land, the prison camp, the Tractatus reads differently. That final proposition, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, stops sounding like a logical conclusion and starts sounding like something closer to a prayer or a survival strategy. Wittgenstein had spent his whole life surrounded by things that couldn't be said, grief that the family wouldn't discuss, a brother's sexuality that had no language it could safely inhabit, the particular loneliness of being the strange, intense youngest child in a house full of ghosts. The limits of language weren't an abstract problem for him. They were the walls of the room he'd been living in since childhood. And maybe that's why the book had to consume itself. Maybe the only honest thing a person shaped by that much silence could build was something that, in the end, pointed back at the silence and said, "This is where the real things are, not in what I've written, in what I couldn't." Something happened to Wittgenstein during the war that had nothing to do with philosophy. Or maybe it had everything to do with it. It depends on how you draw the line between a person's thinking and whatever's going on underneath the thinking, in the part of them that the thinking is trying to reach. In September 1914, just weeks after enlisting, Wittgenstein was somewhere in a small town in occupied Poland. And he wandered into a bookstore, one of those shops that somehow keeps its doors open even as the world is falling apart around it, and found a book by Leo Tolstoy. Not one of the novels, not War and Peace or Anna Karenina. It was called The Gospel in Brief, and it was Tolstoy's attempt to strip the Christian Gospels down to their ethical core, to pull out the miracles and the theology and the institutional apparatus and leave behind just the moral teaching. Just the part about how to live. Wittgenstein bought it, and then he didn't just read it, he absorbed it. He carried it with him everywhere, in his pack, in his coat, on his body at all times, the way some soldiers carry photographs or letters from home. He memorized entire passages. He recommended it to anyone who would listen, which in the trenches was not many people. His fellow soldiers noticed. They started calling him the man with the Gospels. Not mockingly exactly, but with the kind of wary bemusement you direct at someone who has latched onto something with an intensity that makes you slightly uncomfortable. And Wittgenstein later said straightforwardly, without drama, that the book kept him alive, that without Tolstoy's gospel he would not have survived the war. Given what we know about the Wittgenstein brothers, given the suicidal thoughts that had already been circling him for years, that's not a figure of speech. He meant it literally. The book was a talisman. It was the thing he held on to when everything else, the shelling, the mud, the death that pressed in from every side, suggested there was no reason to keep holding on. What's worth sitting with is what the book did to his thinking. Because before the war, Wittgenstein's philosophical work was almost entirely concerned with logic, pure, cold, crystalline logic, the structure of propositions, the relationship between language and facts, the question of what can be said with absolute precision. That was the project. And it was a project that had no particular use for God or meaning or the unsayable, or any of the things that Tolstoy's stripped-down gospel was saturated with. But after he found that book, after he carried it through bombardments and retreats and long dead stretches of waiting, something shifted. The philosophical work didn't stop. He kept writing the propositions that would become the Tractatus, but now there was something else running alongside it, a conviction that was growing quietly, the way convictions do when they take root during a crisis rather than an argument. Wittgenstein was undergoing what can only be called a religious conversion, not to any church. Not to any creed, but to the idea that the most important things, meaning, value, the ethical core of a life, existed in a region that his logical work could point toward but never enter. That logic could map the boundary, but whatever was on the other side of it was real, and it mattered more than anything on the map. Here's where it gets strange or intimate, really. Because while all of this was happening, while Wittgenstein was building his logical system on one track and undergoing a spiritual transformation on another, he was also keeping a record, his wartime notebooks, and the notebooks had a peculiar structure. He wrote on both sides of each opening. The right-hand pages carried his philosophical reflections, the propositions, the logical arguments, the working drafts of what would become the Tractatus, written in ordinary script, legible to anyone who picked them up. The left-hand pages were different. On those pages Wittgenstein wrote in code, a simple cipher, nothing that would have taken a determined codebreaker more than an afternoon to crack, but it wasn't meant to resist professional scrutiny. It was meant to create a boundary, a wall between the philosophical work and something far more personal, because the coded pages contained confessions about his despair, about his loneliness, about his prayers to God, actual prayers, written by a man who was simultaneously constructing one of the most rigorously atheistic-seeming philosophical systems in history, and about his sexuality, which in the Austria of that era was something that could destroy a person, something that had already destroyed his brother Rudy in a bar in Berlin with a glass of milk and potassium cyanide. The coded entries weren't fully published in English until 2022. So for nearly a century, the public version of Wittgenstein was the right-hand pages only, the logic, the precision, the architecture of language. The left-hand pages, the ones where he was actually alive in the messy, frightened, praying, desiring way that humans are alive, those stayed hidden. Two parallel texts running side by side in the same notebook, one in plain script and one in code. Logic and prayer. The sayable and the unsayable, separated by nothing more than the spine of the book. There's something about that image that feels like it belongs at the center of everything Wittgenstein was trying to work out. The Tractatus draws a line between what can be said and what can only be shown, and here was its author physically drawing that same line in his own notebooks, philosophy on one side, the raw facts of his inner life on the other. The split wasn't just theoretical for him. It was daily practice. It was how he organized his mind during the worst years of his life. And then on June 11, 1916, he was still on active duty, still carrying the Tolstoy, still writing philosophy under conditions that made sustained thought a kind of minor miracle. He wrote something in his notebook that pulls the whole thing together. It's one of those entries that lands differently depending on when in your life you encounter it. He wrote, "I know that this world exists, that something about it is problematic, which we call its meaning, that this meaning does not lie in it but outside it. The meaning of life, i.e. the meaning of the world, we can call God." Not an argument, not a proof. It reads more like a series of things he's saying to himself quietly in the dark as a way of steadying his footing. I know this world exists, okay, start there, something about it is problematic. Yes, the existence of the world isn't self-explanatory. There's a question embedded in the fact of it. That meaning does not lie in it but outside it, and here's the turn. The meaning of the world isn't somewhere inside the world. You can't find it by cataloging facts or mapping the logical structure of reality. It's outside, beyond the reach of anything that language can grab hold of. And then the meaning of life, i.e. the meaning of the world, we can call God. He's not making a theological argument. He's not saying there's a being named God who created the universe and has opinions about what you do on Sundays. He's saying that whatever gives the world its meaning, the thing that logic can't capture and language can't say, and the right-hand pages of his notebooks can never quite reach, we might as well call it God, because we don't have a better word. This is the man who was building the Tractatus, the man who would declare that the limits of his language are the limits of his world, and in the middle of a war, in a notebook entry that blurs the line between philosophy and prayer, he placed meaning firmly outside those limits, outside the world, outside language, in exactly the territory that Proposition 7 would later fall silent before. The Tolstoy, the coded pages, the wartime entry, they're all pieces of the same realization, that the logical work wasn't wrong, it was just incomplete, that the ladder he was building could only reach so high, and the things that mattered most, the things that had kept him alive when his brothers hadn't survived, the things he wrote about in code because they were too real for plain script, those things lived above the top rung, in the silence. In the space where the ladder ends and you're left standing with nothing but the quiet fact of your own existence, and the strange, unsolvable problem of what it means. So the ladder was being built. That's where we are, Wittgenstein, still in the middle of the war, still carrying the Tolstoy, still scribbling logic on the right-hand pages and confessions on the left, and somewhere in the background of all that intensity, assembling the actual structure of the book that would become the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And the central idea of that book, the engine that drives the whole thing, came from a place you'd never expect. A courtroom in Paris. Wittgenstein read a newspaper report. The exact date is fuzzy, but it was sometime during the war about a trial involving an automobile accident. The lawyers, trying to make the judge understand what had happened, built a physical model, miniature dolls for the people involved, little toy cars, a model bus. They arranged all of it on a table to reconstruct the accident, this doll here, this car approaching from there, the bus positioned like so. A diorama of a real event, scaled down and simplified but preserving the spatial relationships. The positions of the objects in the model corresponded to the positions of the real things in the real street. The model worked because it shared something with reality, not the materials. The dolls weren't people, the toy cars weren't cars. What it shared was structure, the arrangement, the way the pieces related to each other. And something clicked. Wittgenstein realized that language might work the same way, that a sentence, a meaningful sentence, one that says something true or false about the world, is a kind of picture. Not a picture in the sense of a painting or a photograph, a picture in the sense of that courtroom model. A proposition represents a possible state of affairs by having the same logical structure as the state of affairs it describes. The words in a sentence are like the dolls and toy cars. They're not the things themselves. But their arrangement mirrors the arrangement of the things, and that's how meaning happens. This is the picture theory of language, and it sounds almost too simple when you say it quickly. Language pictures reality, okay, sure. But sit with it for a moment and it starts doing strange things to how you think about what it means to say anything at all. Because if a sentence is a picture, then it can only picture things that have structure, things that can be arranged, facts and combinations of objects in specific configurations. And that means there are things that language simply cannot picture. Not because we haven't found the right words yet, but because the things themselves don't have the kind of structure that a picture could capture. Values, meaning, the experience of being alive, the stuff that Wittgenstein had been writing about in code on his left-hand pages. Those aren't facts. They aren't objects arranged in configurations. They're something else entirely. And if language is picturing and picturing requires structure, then those things fall outside the frame, permanently. You can already hear Proposition 7 approaching, can't you? Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The picture theory doesn't just describe how language works, it draws the border around what language can reach. And everything Wittgenstein cared about most, everything the Tolstoy and the prayers and the coded confessions were reaching toward, is on the other side of that border. He built this idea into a book, and the book had a shape that was as obsessive and particular as anything else about its author. The Tractatus consists of exactly 7 primary propositions, 7, numbered 1 through 7, and then sub-comments nested beneath each proposition using decimal notation. So Proposition 1 has sub-comments 1.1, 1.11, 1.12. Proposition 2 has 2.01, 2.011, and so on. The decimals indicated logical weight and hierarchy. 1.1 is a comment on Proposition 1, and 1.11 is a comment on the comment, its architecture. The numbering system is the skeleton of the argument, making visible which ideas support which thoughts are primary and which are secondary, how the whole thing hangs together. And Wittgenstein was not casual about this. When the publisher Ludwig von Ficker was preparing the book for publication, he suggested, reasonably enough, you'd think that maybe the decimal numbers could be dropped, that the text could just be printed as continuous prose, or at least without all those fussy numerical tags. It would read more naturally. It would look less like a technical manual. Wittgenstein refused, flatly. He told von Ficker that the decimal numbers were the only thing making the book clear, that without them the Tractatus would be, his words, an incomprehensible mess, not slightly harder to follow, not less elegant, an incomprehensible mess. For Wittgenstein, the numbering wasn't decoration or academic convention, it was the book. The logical relationships encoded in those decimals were the argument. Strip them away and you don't have a less pretty version of the same thing, you have nothing. A pile of sentences that have lost their structure. Which is sort of the picture theory applied to itself, if you think about it. The Tractatus is a picture of the logical structure of language, and like any picture, its meaning depends on the arrangement of its parts. Move the parts around, remove the numbering that shows how they relate, and the picture stops picturing anything. It becomes noise. There's something almost touching about this when you remember who we're talking about. A man who wrote his deepest feelings in code because they were too dangerous to leave in plain sight. A man who was, at this very moment, trying to articulate the idea that the most important things in life exist beyond the reach of any structure, any arrangement, any picture. And yet here he was, insisting desperately, it seems, that the structure of his own book was sacred, that the decimals mattered, that the architecture was everything. Maybe that's the tension at the heart of the Tractatus. The book is a monument to structure, every proposition numbered, every logical relationship mapped, every thought placed precisely in its hierarchy, and the whole thing is building toward the conclusion that structure isn't enough, that the ladder of logic, carefully constructed, rung by numbered rung, decimal by decimal, leads you to a place where you have to let go of it, where the numbering stops. Where proposition 7 sits alone, unnumbered by sub-comments, with nothing beneath it. Just the silence that the structure was always pointing toward. So Wittgenstein had his book, this extraordinary, obsessively structured, self-consuming work of logic, 7 propositions, nested decimals, the whole architecture built to lead you to the edge of language and then push you off. The Tractatus was finished, or at least he believed it was finished. He'd written it in trenches, in artillery positions, in a prisoner of war camp in Italy after the war ended. He believed, genuinely, without false modesty, that he had solved the fundamental problems of philosophy, that the book showed, once and for all, what language could do and where it had to stop, that there was nothing left to say. The world, it turned out, did not agree, or rather, the world couldn't even get to the point of agreeing or disagreeing, because nobody wanted to publish it. Wittgenstein sent the manuscript to Jahoda and Siegel, a Viennese publisher, in 1918. They turned it down, which, if you've ever tried to read the Tractatus cold, no context, no guide, just those numbered propositions marching forward in their decimal rows, is maybe not shocking. The book doesn't explain itself. It doesn't ease you in. It starts with, the world is everything that is the case, and expects you to keep up. It's 75 pages long, and it feels like 700. Or 7, depending on whether you're reading the words or the silences between them. So rejection, and then things got complicated because Bertrand Russell entered the picture. Russell was, at this point, one of the most famous philosophers alive. He'd been Wittgenstein's mentor at Cambridge before the war. He'd recognized Wittgenstein's genius almost immediately, had said, in fact, that Wittgenstein was the most perfect example of genius he'd ever encountered. And Russell offered to write an introduction to the Tractatus, something that would explain to readers what this strange, compressed, almost aggressive little book was actually doing, a kind of guidebook, a way in. Wittgenstein said no. He didn't want an introduction. He didn't want the book interpreted for people who couldn't handle it on its own terms. He tried Cambridge University Press, insisting on publishing the Tractatus without any preface or introduction at all, just the 7 propositions and their decimals standing alone. Cambridge turned him down. And here's where the story gets quietly painful, because Wittgenstein needed the book published. Not for career reasons. He'd already decided he was done with philosophy, that there was nothing more to work on after the Tractatus. He needed it published because the work existed and deserved to exist in the world. So eventually, reluctantly, he agreed to let Russell write the introduction after all. And the introduction did what introductions are supposed to do. It opened doors. An English edition was arranged. The German text was published in 1921 in the Annalen der Naturphilosophie, a German scientific journal, not a philosophy journal, because that's where someone finally said yes. It appeared alongside articles about thermodynamics and biological taxonomy, the most important work of logic since Aristotle, tucked in between papers on heat transfer. But the introduction, the thing that got the book into print, became the thing that haunted Wittgenstein, because Russell, for all his brilliance, didn't understand the book, not the way Wittgenstein meant it. They'd met in The Hague in December 1919, specifically so that Wittgenstein could explain his own book to his own mentor. Think about that for a moment. The man who supervised Wittgenstein's philosophical development, who had spent years in conversation with him about logic and language and the foundations of mathematics, that man read the finished Tractatus and needed to be sat down and walked through it. Russell himself admitted that he hadn't grasped the main contention on his first reading. And after the meeting in The Hague, after the explanation, after the conversation, Russell wrote the introduction anyway, and Wittgenstein despised it. He believed Russell had fundamentally misunderstood the central point, not a minor point, not a technical detail about logical atomism or the nature of propositions. The central point, the thing the whole book was about. Now, what was that central point? This is where it gets interesting in a quiet sort of way, because what Russell's introduction does is treat the Tractatus as a work of logic. Which it is, obviously it is, but for Wittgenstein the logical analysis was never the destination, it was the means. The whole elaborate structure, the picture theory, the truth tables, the numbered propositions was the ladder, and the destination was proposition 7, the silence. The ethical, the mystical, the things that cannot be said. Russell's introduction talks about the logic, the pictures, the structure, and treats those as the achievement. Wittgenstein thought the achievement was showing that all of that, all the logic, all the analysis, all the structure, ultimately points beyond itself, that the most important message of the Tractatus is contained in what it doesn't say. Which is, honestly, a nearly impossible thing to communicate in an introduction. This book is about the things it can't talk about. Try putting that on a dust jacket. So the book that was supposed to end philosophy, that Wittgenstein believed had ended philosophy, entered the world through a door held open by someone who didn't quite understand what was walking through it. Russell's introduction was generous, thoughtful, well-intended, and wrong, or at least wrong about what mattered most, and Wittgenstein knew it and accepted it anyway, because the alternative was the manuscript sitting in a drawer forever. There's something in that story that goes beyond publishing woes. It touches the very thing the Tractatus is about. Wittgenstein wrote a book arguing that the most important things cannot be put into words, and then he discovered that the most important thing about his own book couldn't be put into words either, not by him, not by Russell, not by the introduction that was supposed to bridge the gap between the text and its readers. The mentor couldn't grasp the main contention. The introduction that got it published missed the point. The book that was supposed to end all philosophical confusion entered the world wrapped in a new layer of philosophical confusion. And Wittgenstein, who had already given away his family fortune and was planning to become a village schoolteacher in rural Austria, just let it happen. He let the book go out into the world wearing the wrong introduction, carrying the wrong emphasis, being read for the wrong reasons. Because what else could he do? The alternative was silence, real silence, not the philosophical kind, the manuscript in a drawer, unread. At least this way the words existed somewhere, even if nobody could hear what they were actually saying. Which might be the most Tractarian thing of all. The book argues that showing is different from saying, that you can show something through the structure of language that you could never successfully say in words. And the Tractatus itself showed its meaning. It showed it through its shape, its decimals, its self-consuming logic, its final silence. But when people tried to say what it meant, Russell in his introduction, commentators for decades afterward, they kept getting it wrong. The showing worked, the saying didn't. Just like the book predicted. And that gap between showing and saying wasn't just a publishing mishap, it was the engine of the whole book. Wittgenstein called it the Tractatus's main contention, not one claim among many, the main one, the thing the entire architecture was built to demonstrate, and he put it simply, what can be shown cannot be said. That sounds like a riddle, but it's more like an observation about how language works when you push it to its edges. Think about your eye. Your eye can see everything in front of it, this room, that wall, the light coming through the window, the dust floating in the beam, everything except itself. Your eye can never appear in its own visual field. It can see the world, but it can't see the thing that makes seeing possible. And language, Wittgenstein thought, has the same problem. Language can describe facts about the world. The cat is on the mat. Water boils at 100 degrees. There are more stars than grains of sand. It can picture those facts, map them, arrange them into propositions that are true or false. But the thing that makes all of that possible, the logical structure that language and the world share, the framework that allows a sentence to mean anything at all, that thing can't be said in language. It can only be shown. It shows itself every time a sentence successfully means something. But you can never step outside language and describe what's making it work, any more than your eye can turn around and look at itself. Which sounds like a limitation, and it is in one sense, but Wittgenstein didn't treat it as a failure. He treated it as the most important insight in the entire book, because once you see that the boundary exists, once you understand that there are things language can show but never say, then you start to notice what's on the other side of that boundary. And what's on the other side, for Wittgenstein, wasn't nothing. It was everything that actually matters. Proposition 6.522. You can find it near the end of the book, in that final stretch where the numbered propositions start thinning out, getting shorter, almost aphoristic, as if the text itself is running out of breath. And this is what it says: there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. The word indeed matters here. In German, it's allerdings, a word that carries a particular weight, a kind of emphatic concession. Not perhaps there are things beyond words, or one might argue that, no, indeed, as in, this is real. This isn't a theoretical possibility being entertained for the sake of completeness. The unsayable isn't a gap in our knowledge that better language might someday fill. It's a positive reality. Things that cannot be put into words are not absent from the world, they are present in it, making themselves manifest, showing themselves constantly. We encounter them all the time. We just can't talk about them. Not because we lack vocabulary, not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because the attempt to say them is the wrong kind of operation entirely. Like trying to weigh the color blue. The tools don't fit the task. And that word mystical, Wittgenstein meant something very specific by it, something quieter and more precise than the word usually carries. He wasn't talking about seances or visions or encounters with the supernatural. He wasn't even talking about religious experience exactly, though he was deeply shaped by religious feeling. The mystical for Wittgenstein was something almost startlingly simple. Proposition 6.44, not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. Read that again slowly, not how the world is. Not its mechanisms, its processes, the way one thing causes another, the laws of physics, the chemical reactions, the evolutionary pressures, the mathematical regularities. Science handles all of that. Science is brilliant at how. How does gravity work? How do cells divide? How did the universe begin? These are questions that have answers, or at least they're the kind of questions where answers are the right sort of thing to look for. Language can handle them. Propositions can picture them. The logical structure of fact-stating language maps neatly onto the logical structure of cause and effect. But that the world is, that anything exists at all, that there is something rather than nothing. Science can't even begin to formulate that question, let alone answer it, because science operates within the world. It explains this event in terms of that prior event, this law in terms of that deeper law. It can trace the chain of causes as far back as you like, but it can never step outside the chain and ask why there's a chain at all. The existence of the world is not a fact within the world. It's the condition that makes all facts possible. And when you genuinely stop and feel the strangeness of that, when you really let it land, not as an abstract philosophical puzzle, but as an experience, the sheer baffling there-ness of things that, Wittgenstein said, is the mystical. Not an argument, not a proof, not a doctrine, just the experience of wonder at existence itself, which language can point toward but never capture. And the thing is, everyone has this experience. You've had it. Maybe late at night, or early in the morning, or in some moment when the usual business of living fell away and you were left with just this. The world here existing, for no reason you can name. It's one of the most common human experiences there is, and one of the most impossible to communicate. You can gesture at it. You can say, "Isn't it strange that anything exists?" And someone might nod and say, "Yeah, I guess," but the sentence doesn't carry the experience. The experience is in the stopping, in the silence that opens up when the question hits you for real. Wittgenstein built the most rigorous logical system of his century, and the whole point of it was to get to that silence, to draw the boundary of what language can do so precisely that you could see, with absolute clarity, what lies beyond it, not as mysticism in the hand-wavy sense, as logical conclusion, as something the structure of the book itself shows you, even though, especially though, it could never be said. The eye can't see itself, language can't say what makes language possible, and the most important things in life, the things that hit you at 3 in the morning when everything else falls away, are not the kind of things that fit into sentences. They are what is mystical, they make themselves manifest. You already know this, you've always known it. Wittgenstein just built the proof. So here was Wittgenstein having built the proof, having drawn the line between what language can do and what it can't, having shown, not said, that the most important things in life are beyond the reach of propositions. And then he did something that makes the whole story stranger and maybe more honest than it would otherwise be. He wrote a letter. It was addressed to Ludwig von Ficker, a literary editor and publisher whom Wittgenstein respected deeply. And in this letter, Wittgenstein said something about the Tractatus that he never said in the book itself. He wrote, "My work consists of 2 parts, the one which is here, and of everything which I have not written, and precisely this second part is the important one." Sit with that for a moment. A philosopher wrote a book of rigorous logic, of numbered propositions, of truth tables and picture theory and the structure of reality, and then told someone privately in a letter that the important part was everything he didn't write. The book you can hold in your hands, the 75 pages of dense logical analysis, that was the lesser half. The greater half was the silence around it, the unwritten book. The space the text carved out by establishing, with logical precision, where language has to stop. And the purpose of the written half, he explained to von Ficker, was ethical. Not logical, not linguistic, not epistemological, ethical. The whole elaborate architecture of facts and propositions and logical space was a way of delimiting the ethical from within, like drawing a circle around something by carefully mapping everything that's outside it. You never touch the thing itself, you never name it. But by the time you've finished drawing the boundary, anyone looking at the map can see exactly where it is. The silence at the center is more precisely defined than any words could have made it. This letter didn't surface publicly for decades, and when it did, it changed how people read the Tractatus, because without it, you can read the book as a work of logic, brilliant, strange, self-consuming, but ultimately about language and logical structure. With it, you realize the whole thing was an elaborate ethical act, a man trying to point at what matters most by rigorously mapping everything that doesn't. But there's a painful irony in the middle of all this, because the people who adopted the Tractatus most enthusiastically, the people who made it famous, who built an intellectual movement around it, were precisely the people who read it as a work of logic and nothing more. The Vienna Circle, a group of philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists who met regularly in Vienna in the 1920s and 1930s and who treated the Tractatus as their founding scripture. They read it aloud, line by line, working through it systematically over the course of an entire year. They took its logical analysis of language as the basis for their entire philosophical program, logical positivism, the idea that meaningful statements are either logical tautologies or empirically verifiable facts, and everything else is nonsense. And the Tractatus does say something like that in a certain light. It does argue that the only meaningful propositions are those that picture facts about the world. It does conclude that ethical, aesthetic, and metaphysical statements are beyond the reach of language. But the Vienna Circle took that conclusion and turned it upside down. Where Wittgenstein said the unsayable is real and important, but we must pass over it in silence, they heard the unsayable is meaningless, throw it out. Where Wittgenstein saw the boundary of language as a doorway to something profound and inexpressible, they saw it as a wall with nothing on the other side. Ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, not just unsayable, but empty, literally senseless, not even wrong. Wittgenstein was horrified. He told Moritz Schlick, the founder of the Vienna Circle, the man who had organized the reading sessions, who had personally cultivated a relationship with Wittgenstein, that Rudolf Carnap had completely misunderstood the last sentences of the book and hence the fundamental conception of the entire book. Not a minor misunderstanding, not a quibble about notation or scope, the fundamental conception, the whole point. The same complaint he'd had about Russell's introduction, now replayed at a larger scale with higher stakes. An entire philosophical movement built on his work, getting the main idea exactly backward. There's a pattern here, and it's hard not to see it as almost designed to make the Tractatus's own point. The book says the most important things can't be said, and then, repeatedly, people try to say what the book means, and they get the most important part wrong. It's as if the text is a machine for generating its own misreadings. And this is where Wittgenstein did the thing that still confuses biographers. Having published what he believed was the final word in philosophy, having literally written to Russell that the problems of philosophy were, in essentials, finally solved, he walked away. Not from the ideas, from philosophy itself, from academia, from the intellectual world entirely. He gave away his fortune, and when we say fortune, we need to be specific about the scale, because it changes what the gesture means. The Wittgenstein family wealth was built on steel. Karl Wittgenstein, Ludwig's father, had been one of the most powerful industrialists in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sometimes called the Andrew Carnegie of Austria. The family fortune was one of the largest in Europe, and Ludwig gave it all away. Not to charity, not to a foundation, not to some cause that would carry his name. He gave it to his siblings. He wanted none of it. He made a vow he would never spend money he hadn't earned with his own hands. And then he went to become an elementary school teacher. In rural Austria, in tiny villages, Trattenbach, Puchberg, Otterthal, the kind of places where a man with a Cambridge education and a family name that meant steel mills and concert halls must have seemed like a visitor from another planet. He taught children arithmetic and spelling and German grammar. He was, by most accounts, a complicated teacher, passionate and demanding, sometimes too demanding, sometimes frightening to the smaller children. He took the work seriously in a way that could be intense. He wasn't hiding from the world or playing at simplicity. He genuinely believed after the Tractatus that there was nothing left to do in philosophy, and he needed to do something real, something with his hands and his days, something that wasn't just words about words about words. There's a version of this story where it looks like burnout or eccentricity, or the kind of dramatic gesture that wealthy intellectuals sometimes make when they want to feel authentic. But that misses what was actually happening. Wittgenstein had written a book arguing that the most important things in life, ethics, meaning the experience of wonder at existence, are beyond the reach of language. and then he went and lived that conclusion. If the important things can't be said, then spending your life saying things, even brilliant things, even revolutionary things, is a strange way to spend it. Better to teach children. Better to do something that exists in the world of actions and experiences rather than the world of propositions. The man who drew the boundary of language went to live on the other side of it. He would stay away from philosophy for nearly a decade, and when he came back, when he eventually returned to Cambridge in 1929, pulled back by conversations and problems and the slow realization that maybe the Tractatus hadn't solved everything after all, he would come back as a different kind of thinker. But that's getting ahead of things. For now, picture this, a village in the Austrian Alps, sometime in the mid-1920s. A thin, intense man in his mid-30s, standing in front of a classroom of children, teaching them to count. Behind him, in the bookshops and lecture halls of Vienna, a circle of brilliant men is reading his book aloud, line by line, building an empire of ideas on its foundation. They think they understand it. He knows they don't. And he's here in this village because he believes, for now at least, that the right response to the limits of language is not to keep talking about them. It's to stop talking. The decision to stop talking didn't come out of nowhere. It had deep roots, deeper than the Tractatus itself, reaching back into philosophical territory that Wittgenstein had been navigating since before the war. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, of the will, of the world as representation. Wittgenstein read him early, absorbed him, argued with him, and never quite left him behind. And the influence shows up in a very specific place, right at the boundary where the Tractatus meets ethics. Schopenhauer had this idea about the ethical subject, the willing self, the part of you that makes choices and values and cares about things. And his insight, which Wittgenstein adopted and transformed, was that this subject doesn't exist inside the world. It exists at the boundary. The willing subject stands at the edge of everything, looking in but never appearing among the objects and facts it surveys. Like the eye again, the eye is the condition for seeing, but it never shows up in what it sees. The ethical self is the condition for meaning, for value, for the world mattering at all, but it never shows up as a fact within the world. Wittgenstein took this and pushed it further. In the Tractatus he wrote, "If good or bad willing changes the world, it can only change the limits of the world, not the facts. The facts stay the same. The cat is still on the mat, water still boils at 100 degrees, the stars are still there, but the limits, the way the world is bounded, the frame through which you see everything, that can shift. Good or bad willing doesn't rearrange the furniture, it changes the room. Or rather, it changes the shape of the room, the contours of what's possible, the way the whole thing hangs together. And since the ethical subject is at the boundary rather than inside it, ethical change is a change in boundaries, not in content, a change in how the world is experienced as a whole, not in what it contains." This is hard to say clearly, which, of course, is exactly the point. Ethics, for Wittgenstein, belong to the category of things that resist being said. And by 1929, after years of village school teaching, after slowly being pulled back toward philosophy, he tried to say it anyway. He gave a lecture, just one, a lecture on ethics, delivered to a literary society in Cambridge called the Heretics. It's the only popular lecture Wittgenstein ever gave, and it survives because someone kept notes and because the text was eventually published after his death. And in it, Wittgenstein does something remarkable. He tries to talk about the very thing his own philosophy says you can't talk about. He described the impulse behind ethics and religion as running against the boundaries of language. And then he said it was perfectly, absolutely hopeless, like running against the walls of a cage. You throw yourself at the boundary again and again, and the boundary doesn't give. Language can't express ethical value. It can't capture what makes a good life good or a meaningful experience meaningful. Every attempt to say something ethical or religious in the form of a proposition, this is good, God exists, life has meaning, produces something that is, strictly speaking, nonsense. Not wrong, not false, nonsense. The words don't picture any state of affairs. They don't map onto any fact. Their language being used in a way that language isn't equipped for, like trying to use a hammer to listen to music. Perfectly, absolutely hopeless. But and this is the turn that matters, Wittgenstein didn't say it with contempt. He didn't say it the way the Vienna Circle would have, as a dismissal. He said it with something close to reverence, because this hopeless impulse, this running against the walls of the cage, was not a mistake to be corrected. It was not a confusion to be cleared up by better logical analysis. It was, he said, a tendency that he deeply respected, a human tendency, perhaps the human tendency. The thing that makes us what we are, this need to reach beyond what can be said, to try to express the inexpressible, to run against the walls even though the walls will never give. There's a gentleness in that, a kindness even. The man who built the most rigorous logical system of his century, who could dismantle an argument with surgical precision, who reduced students to tears in seminars with the intensity of his questioning, that man stood in front of a literary society and said, essentially, the most important things we do are hopeless, and that's not a reason to stop doing them. It's the reason they matter. In the same lecture, he tried to give examples. 3 experiences, he said, that point toward the ethical, toward the unsayable, and he was careful about them. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was trying to show what it feels like to run against the wall. The first, wonder at the existence of the world. We've already been here, proposition 6.44, not how the world is, but that it is. But in the lecture, he made it more personal. He described the experience of being amazed that the world exists at all. And then he showed how language fails it, because when you try to put this experience into a proposition, I wonder at the existence of the world, the sentence looks meaningful but isn't. In the ordinary sense, to wonder at something is to wonder at it being the case when it might not have been. You wonder at a dog's size because the dog might have been smaller. You wonder at the sunrise because you can imagine darkness. But you can't wonder at the existence of the world in that way because you can't coherently imagine the world not existing. The sentence, I wonder that the world exists, borrows the grammar of meaningful wonder but empties it of content. It's nonsense, beautiful, important, deeply human nonsense. The second, absolute safety. The experience of feeling safe, not from any particular threat, but absolutely safe in a way that nothing could possibly touch. Wittgenstein described it carefully and then showed the same collapse. In ordinary language, safety means safety from something, from fire, from poverty, from a specific danger. Absolute safety, safety from everything, safety in principle, doesn't describe any state of affairs. It can't be pictured by a proposition. Again, the experience is real, common, recognizable to anyone who's felt it. But the words that try to capture it dissolve into nonsense on examination. The third, guilt, not guilt about having done something specific, not I feel guilty about forgetting her birthday, but absolute guilt. A sense of wrongness that doesn't attach to any particular act, a feeling that something is fundamentally off in a way that goes beyond any specific transgression. And once again, the same logical breakdown. Guilt in the ordinary sense points at a specific cause. Absolute guilt points at nothing or at everything, which amounts to the same thing linguistically. 3 experiences, 3 attempts to say what they are, 3 collapses into nonsense. Not because the experiences are unreal, they're among the most vivid and universal things human beings encounter, but because language is the wrong tool for holding them. They're shown, not said, manifest, not formulated, real but inexpressible. And Wittgenstein, having demonstrated all of this, having shown 3 times over that the walls of the cage don't give, said he respected the impulse to run against them. He would not ridicule it, he would not dismiss it. Because the running itself, the hopeless, necessary, beautifully futile attempt to say what can't be said, is what it means to be the kind of creature that cares about meaning. That needs ethics and religion and wonder, even though none of it can be captured in the kind of language that the Tractatus declared to be the only meaningful kind. The cage is real, the walls don't move, and the running matters more than anything else we do. That lecture was given in 1929, the same year Wittgenstein came back to Cambridge. And coming back meant something very specific. It meant facing the possibility that the Tractatus wasn't finished, that the book he'd believed had solved all the fundamental problems of philosophy, the book he'd walked away from, given away his fortune over, spent years as a village schoolteacher because of might have gotten things wrong. Not small things, grave things. Wittgenstein himself used that word, grave mistakes, and what's extraordinary is that he didn't flinch from it. He didn't try to patch the Tractatus, to issue corrections, to publish an updated edition with footnotes explaining where the earlier version had gone astray. He set about dismantling it. Systematically, over the course of nearly 20 years, he built a second philosophy that contradicted the first at almost every structural level. The result was the Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953, a book so different from the Tractatus that it's hard to believe the same mind produced both. And yet the same mind did. This is the thing about Wittgenstein that sets him apart from nearly every other major philosopher in history. Philosophers revise, they refine, they develop, they extend their early ideas into later, more sophisticated versions. Wittgenstein didn't do that. He produced two revolutionary works of philosophy that fundamentally contradict each other, not in minor ways, not at the margins, but at the core. The Tractatus says language has one essential structure, the picture theory, the logical form shared by propositions and facts. The Investigations says language has no single structure at all. The picture theory had been elegant, beautiful really in its severity. Language works by picturing reality. A proposition shares its logical form with the state of affairs it describes. Meaning is a matter of structure. Get the structure right and the sentence maps onto the world. Get it wrong and you have nonsense. It was clean. It was precise. And Wittgenstein eventually decided it was wrong. What replaced it was messier, deliberately messier. Because the world, Wittgenstein came to believe, is messier than the Tractatus allowed. Language games, that was the new concept, the new framework. Meaning doesn't come from a sentence's logical structure or its correspondence with facts. Meaning comes from use, from how a word functions within a particular activity, a particular context, a particular form of life. The word game is itself a kind of demonstration. Think about what the word game means. Chess is a game, tag is a game, solitaire is a game, the Olympic Games, mind games, a cat playing with a piece of string. There's no single feature that all games share, no essence of game-ness that you could extract and define. What there is, Wittgenstein said, is a complicated network of similarities, family resemblances, he called them, overlapping and crisscrossing like the features in a family where the son has the mother's eyes and the father's chin but the grandfather's nose, and no single feature runs through all of them. Language works the same way. Words don't have fixed meanings anchored to logical structures. They have uses, and those uses shift depending on the game being played. Water means one thing if you're thirsty, another if you're warning someone about a flood, another if you're baptizing a child, another if you're labeling a chemical compound. Same word, different game, different meaning. And there is no master game, no language behind all the particular uses that determines what water really means. The meaning is the use, full stop. This was a demolition of the Tractatus's central insight. The picture theory said there was one kind of meaningful language, fact-statting, world-picturing, logically structured propositions, and everything else was technically nonsense, even if it was the important kind of nonsense. The language games view said there are countless kinds of meaningful language, none of them more fundamental than the others, and the Tractatus's mistake was thinking that one particular game, the logical propositional game, was the whole of language. But here's where things get interesting in a quieter way. Scholars have been arguing for decades about whether Wittgenstein's deepest conviction actually changed. The surface architecture is completely different, picture theory gone, language games in, logical form out, use in. But underneath all of that, at the level of what Wittgenstein cared about most, the limits of language, the gap between saying and showing, the reality of the unsayable, did anything really shift? Because the Investigations is also, in its own way, a book about what language can't do. It's a book about the ways we get confused when we take one language game and try to apply it where it doesn't belong. It's a book about the limits of one kind of speaking in the territory of another. The Tractatus drew one big line, sayable here, unsayable there. The Investigations drew 1,000 smaller lines, this game here, that game there, and confusion whenever you cross them without noticing. Different maps, but both are maps of boundaries. Both are ultimately about where language runs out. And Wittgenstein himself in the Investigations kept reaching for the same intuition, that meaning is something shown rather than stated. He wrote, understanding a sentence is much more akin to understanding a theme in music than one may think, not a logical analysis, not a decoding of propositional content. Understanding a theme in music, think about what that means. When you hear a melody and understand it, when it makes sense to you, when you feel it cohere, when you know what it's doing, you don't translate it into words. You don't extract a proposition from it. You just get it. The understanding is in the hearing. It shows itself. You couldn't say what the melody means any more than you could say what the Tractatus means, but the understanding is real and immediate and undeniable. And then the examples he gave for how meaning gets communicated in practice. Whistling a tune, making a gesture, dancing. Not defining, not explaining, not constructing logical pictures. Whistling, gesturing, moving your body. Showing, always showing, meaning made manifest through action and expression rather than pinned down in propositions. The vocabulary was different, the framework was different. The entire philosophical architecture was rebuilt from the ground up. But the silence at the center, the conviction that the things that matter most resist being said, that meaning is shown rather than stated, that language is always pointing past itself toward something it can never quite contain, that silence, some scholars argue, never moved. It was the one still point between two revolutions. The eye that saw everything except itself, in two completely different books about two completely different kinds of seeing. Maybe the grave mistakes were real. Maybe the picture theory was wrong and language games were closer to how things actually work. But maybe the deeper truth, the unwritten half that Wittgenstein told von Ficker was the important part, was never a matter of pictures or games at all. It was what both books were trying to show. And showing doesn't change when you change the saying. The latter looks different. The view from the top is the same. Music kept coming back. It was always there, running underneath the philosophy like a parallel track, or maybe a deeper one. Wittgenstein was an astonishingly gifted musician, not a dabbler, not someone who played a bit of piano at family gatherings and enjoyed concerts on weekends. He could whistle entire parts of Beethoven's string quartets from memory, not the main melody, humming along a specific quartet part, the viola line or the second violin, reproduced with enough precision and feeling that other musicians noticed. His family had been one of the great musical families of Vienna. Brahms and Mahler performed in the Wittgenstein home, as we've already heard, and the children grew up immersed in a level of musical sophistication that most professional musicians never reach. Ludwig absorbed it all. And throughout his life, through the trenches, through the POW camp, through the village schoolrooms, through Cambridge, music remained the one domain where the unsayable didn't need to be struggled with because it could be directly experienced. This is the thing that makes the comparison in the Investigations. Understanding a sentence is like understanding a theme in music, feel less like an analogy and more like a confession. Wittgenstein wasn't reaching for a clever metaphor. He was pointing at the thing he knew best. Music doesn't argue. It doesn't make propositions. A fugue doesn't assert that life is tragic or that joy is possible or that time passes and cannot be recovered. But anyone who has listened to a fugue, really listened, the way you listen when you've forgotten you're listening, knows that it means something. Something precise and unmistakable and completely impossible to put into words. Music shows what it means, and the showing is so immediate, so overwhelming that the question, "But what does it say?" feels almost rude, like asking a sunset to fill out a questionnaire. For a man who spent his philosophical life drawing the boundary between the sayable and the unsayable, music must have been a kind of relief, a territory where the boundary didn't apply, where you could live entirely in the showing without any pressure to translate the experience into propositions. When Wittgenstein whistled a Beethoven quartet part from memory, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do, quartet parts are intricate and interdependent, and reproducing one from memory while hearing the others in your head requires a kind of musical thinking that goes beyond performance. He was, in a sense, doing the thing his philosophy said was the most important thing, engaging with meaning that can only be shown. Participating in the unsayable directly, through the body, through breath, through the precision of pitch and rhythm, not thinking about the limits of language, existing beyond them. He needed that. You can feel it in the biography, the intensity of his intellectual life, the ferocity of his thinking, the way he pursued philosophical problems with a kind of violence that exhausted everyone around him. He needed a place where the pursuit stopped, where meaning was just there, present, unmediated, requiring nothing from him except attention. And he needed space too, physical space, silence, the kind of quiet that doesn't exist in universities. In 1913, before the war, before the Tractatus, before any of it, Wittgenstein fled to Skjolden, Norway, a tiny village at the end of a fjord surrounded by mountains. He built a cabin there, or had one built on a steep slope overlooking a glacial lake. The location was deliberately remote. To reach the cabin, you had to row across the lake. There was no road, no path, no way to get there except by boat. The nearest village was a long row away. And from the cabin, the view was water and mountains and sky, nothing else. He called it the only place where he could think properly. Not well, not productively, properly, as if thinking, real thinking, required a particular kind of environment, and that environment was silence. He wrote about it in a letter, the quiet and perhaps the wonderful scenery, I mean its quiet seriousness, an unusual phrase. He wasn't praising the beauty of the landscape in the way a tourist might. He was describing its character, its quiet seriousness. As if the mountains and the lake and the stillness had a philosophical quality, a gravity, a weight, a refusal to be merely pretty. The scenery was serious in the way that thinking about the limits of language is serious. It earned your attention by being what it was, not by performing for you. Wittgenstein returned to Skjolden repeatedly throughout his life. Once he stayed for 13 months of near total solitude, 13 months, alone in a cabin accessible only by rowboat on the edge of a glacial lake in Norway, thinking. Not teaching, not lecturing, not attending meetings or writing letters or having the kind of philosophical conversations that Cambridge specialized in, just thinking, in silence, in the quiet seriousness of mountains and water. It's tempting to romanticize this, and I want to be careful not to. Wittgenstein wasn't playing at being a hermit. The solitude was, by his own account, often painful. He was not a naturally happy person. The isolation was a tool, not a vacation, something he submitted to because the work required it, the way a diver submits to cold water because that's where the thing you're looking for is. The cabin in Skjolden was less a retreat than a laboratory. A place where the noise of the social world couldn't get in the way of hearing what needed to be heard. This pattern, the flight to silence, the pursuit of meaning beyond words, the conviction that what matters most can only be shown, this pattern runs through Wittgenstein's life like a spine, and it took decades for the rest of the philosophical world to take it seriously. Ingeborg Bachmann changed that. In 1953, the same year the Philosophical Investigations was published posthumously, Bachmann, an Austrian poet and writer, published an essay that cracked open a new way of reading Wittgenstein. She was the first major intellectual to take both halves of the Tractat as seriously as inseparable. Not the logic alone, the way the Vienna Circle had, not the mysticism alone, the way some religious readers tried to, both together. As aspects of a single vision. She wrote that the Tractatus was about anticipating the unsayable, that the entire logical apparatus was a way of reaching towards something that logic itself could never touch. The word anticipating is precise, not capturing, not defining, not containing, anticipating the way you anticipate a piece of music before it arrives, the way you feel the resolution of a chord before you hear it. The logical structure of the Tractatus anticipates the silence at its end, points toward it, lines into it. The whole book is a structure of anticipation, and what it anticipates is the moment when language falls away and you're left with what? The world, existence, the mystical, the things that make themselves manifest. Bachmann's reading triggered what scholars call a Wittgenstein renaissance, a wave of new engagement with his work that took the mystical dimensions as seriously as the logical ones. For the first time, there was a sustained intellectual tradition that read the Tractatus the way Wittgenstein told von Ficker it should be read, as a work whose most important part is what it doesn't say. The unwritten half, the silence that the logic is designed to create. Music, mountains, silence, a cabin accessible only by rowboat, a book whose most important part was never written, a poet who understood that the logic and the silence were the same thing. These are the territories where Wittgenstein lived, not the lecture hall, not really, not the philosophical seminar, though he spent decades in those too. The real territory was the space beyond language, the place you can get to only by pushing language as far as it will go and then letting it fall away. The place where a whistled Beethoven quartet says more than a library of propositions. The place where the quiet seriousness of a Norwegian lake is its own kind of argument. He kept going back to the cabin, to the silence, to the music, because that was where thinking could happen properly, on the far side of what can be said. But the silence wasn't always the point. Sometimes Wittgenstein wanted the opposite. Sometimes he wanted noise, loud, brainless, overwhelming noise, and he knew exactly where to find it. After his lectures at Cambridge, those intense, draining sessions where he thought out loud, often without notes, sometimes packing, sometimes sitting in a deck chair, working through problems in real time while his students tried to keep up, after all of that, Wittgenstein would rush to the cinema. Not to see something thoughtful, not Bergman, not anything that would make him think. He went to see westerns. Cheap, formulaic, plot-driven American westerns, cowboys and gunfights and horses and dust, the kind of film that no one would ever confuse with art, and he sat in the very front row, deliberately, so that the screen filled his entire field of vision, so that there was nothing else, no room for peripheral awareness, no space for the philosophy to creep back in. Just the movie, wall to wall, crowding out everything. He preferred films with no intellectual pretensions whatsoever. The less a film aspired to meaning, the better. The harder he had been working, the more intensely he had been wrestling with philosophical problems during the day, the more frequently he went. It was a pattern his friends noticed and occasionally found puzzling. This man who thought more rigorously than almost anyone alive, who could hold a philosophical problem in his mind for hours, who lived in the silence beyond language. This man needed, regularly and urgently, to drown all of that out with cowboys shooting at each other. And there's something honest about it that most intellectuals wouldn't admit to. The life of the mind, when it's lived at the intensity Wittgenstein lived it, is exhausting in a way that doesn't have obvious relief. You can't just stop thinking. The problems follow you. They sit in the back of your head while you eat dinner, while you walk, while you try to sleep. The only way to get rid of them temporarily is to overwhelm them with something so immediate and absorbing and deliberately mindless that the philosophical machinery has nothing to grab onto. A Western filling your entire visual field is exactly that. It's a philosophical vacuum. Nothing to interpret, nothing to analyze. Just story, image, motion. The raw experience of watching something happen without needing to think about what it means. Wittgenstein would probably have hated that analysis, by the way. He went to the movies to escape analysis. Making it into a philosophical gesture misses the point. Sometimes a cowboy movie is just a cowboy movie. But then there's the other half of his escapism, and this one is harder to dismiss as mere relaxation. He loved detective fiction. Specifically, he loved hardboiled detective fiction, the pulpy, violent American kind. His favorite magazine was Street and Smith's Detective Story magazine, a cheap publication full of exactly the kind of stories that Cambridge dons were not supposed to read. Stories where a tough man with a gun solves crimes through observation and deduction. Stories built on a single, unwavering faith that everything hidden can be revealed, that every mystery has a solution. That if you look hard enough, think carefully enough, follow the clues with enough rigor, the truth will come out. The detective sees what others miss. The detective pierces through appearance to reality. The detective says what happened. And if you hold that up next to the Tractatus, the mirror effect is almost eerie. Because detective fiction is the exact inverse of Wittgenstein's philosophy. The detective story says, the most important things who committed the murder, why, how are hidden, but they can be found and they can be said. Given enough evidence and enough intelligence, language is adequate to the truth. The mystery is solvable. The hidden can be made visible. The unsayable is merely the not yet said. The Tractatus says the opposite. The most important things are hidden not because we haven't looked hard enough, but because they are, by their nature, the kind of things that can't be put into words. Not hidden like a murderer hiding in a closet. Hidden like the eye hidden from its own visual field. No amount of evidence will help. No amount of intelligence will crack the case. The mystery isn't solvable because it isn't a mystery in the detective fiction sense. It's a feature of the structure of language and reality. The detective operates in a world where everything is in principle sayable. Wittgenstein operated in a world where the most important things are in principle unsayable. So what does it mean that the philosopher of the unsayable loved stories about saying everything? What does it mean that the man who argued that language can never capture what matters most spent his evenings reading stories where language, careful, logical, deductive language, captures exactly what matters most? Maybe it was relief of a different kind than the Westerns. The Westerns drowned out thought. The detective stories offered a fantasy, a world where the Tractatus was wrong. A world where the hidden comes to light, where the unsayable gets said, where enough patience and enough logic will always be enough. A world without the cage, without the walls you can run against but never break through. A world where running works. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just liked a good story where someone figures things out. Not everything has to be a philosophical statement. Wittgenstein of all people would have known that. But the juxtaposition is hard to ignore. A man who spent his days demonstrating that the most important truths resist language, spending his evenings immersed in stories where language is always triumphantly enough. The front row at the cinema, the detective magazine on the nightstand, the cabin in Norway, the whistled Beethoven, the silence of the mountains, and then this, cowboys, detectives. The loudest, most verbal, most resolution-obsessed forms of storytelling available. He needed both, the silence and the noise, the unsayable and the stories that say everything. And maybe that's closer to how most people actually live than either extreme alone. The life of the mind and the life of the front row. The philosophical problem that won't let go and the movie that makes it let go for 90 minutes. The conviction that language has limits and the guilty pleasure of stories where it doesn't. Wittgenstein was a lot of things: genius, ascetic, tormented perfectionist, revolutionary thinker, but he was also a man who sat in the front row of cinemas eating cheap snacks and watching cowboys ride horses across a flickering screen. And he came back from those evenings ready to think again, ready to face the walls of the cage in the morning, refreshed somehow by 90 minutes in a world where there were no walls at all. Wittgenstein arrived at the limits of language through logic, through numbered propositions and truth tables and the most rigorous analysis of how sentences work that philosophy had ever seen. He built a ladder of pure reason, climbed to the top, and found silence. He thought he was doing something new, and in a sense he was. Nobody had ever drawn the boundary from that direction before, using those tools with that kind of precision. But the boundary itself, people had been standing there for thousands of years, had been pointing at it, writing about it, building entire traditions around it. Wittgenstein arrived by a new road, but the destination was ancient. The Tao Te Ching, written or compiled or attributed, depending on which scholar you ask, around the 6th century BCE, by a figure known as Laozi or Lao Tzu, who may or may not have been a single historical person. And the very first line, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Right there, 2,500 years before Proposition 7, before whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, the opening sentence of one of the most influential texts in human history says the same thing. The deepest reality, the Tao, the way, the principle underlying everything, cannot be captured in words. The moment you speak it, you've lost it. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. What you can say about the Tao is precisely what the Tao isn't. But here's where the Eastern traditions did something that Wittgenstein didn't or couldn't or chose not to. Where Wittgenstein fell silent, where he reached the boundary and stopped, laid down the ladder, said thereof one must be silent, and walked away to teach schoolchildren, Eastern traditions treated the limit of language as a starting point. Not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of a different kind of conversation. One conducted through paradox, indirect speech, contradiction, gesture, and the deliberate breaking of language from within. If you can't say the truth directly, maybe you can circle it. Maybe you can use words to undermine themselves, the way the Tractatus used propositions to show that propositions can't reach the most important things. But instead of stopping there, you keep going. You develop techniques. You build a practice around the failure of language, not as resignation, but as method. Pseudo-Dionysius understood this. A mysterious figure from the 5th century, writing under a borrowed name, the name of one of St. Paul's Athenian converts, hence pseudo. He described what happens when the mind tries to ascend toward the divine. At first, language helps. You can say positive things about God. God is good. God is powerful. God is loving. But as you get closer, the positive statements start to feel thin, inadequate, like trying to describe the ocean with a teacup. So you switch to negation. God is not limited, not finite, not comprehensible. Better, closer, but still not there. And as you continue ascending, shedding one description after another, language itself falls away. You are left, Pseudo-Dionysius wrote, speechless and unknowing, plunged into what he called sacred darkness. Not God's absence, the opposite, overwhelming radiance too bright for the mind to process, too much for language to contain. The darkness isn't emptiness, it's excess. Like staring into the sun, the blindness comes from too much light, not too little. Language doesn't fail because there's nothing to say. It fails because there's too much. The reality overflows every container you try to pour it into. This idea that you get closer to truth by progressively stripping away everything you can say about it has a name: apophatic theology, theology by negation, and it's not a footnote in intellectual history. It's a tradition with roots stretching back over 2,000 years. Plato, in his late dialogues, pushed toward a vision of the good that exceeds all description. The Neoplatonists, Plotinus, Proclus, developed elaborate systems of assent that end in silence. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher writing in the 1st century, argued that God is so utterly beyond human comprehension that even the word God is misleading because it implies a category. All of them converging on the same insight: the deepest truths are approached through what you can't say about them, not through what you can. Wittgenstein almost certainly didn't sit down with a copy of Pseudo-Dionysius and decide to build a logical version of apophatic theology, but the convergence is striking. Two completely different starting points, rigorous analytic logic and mystical Christian theology, arriving at the same destination. Language has a boundary. Beyond that boundary, something real exists, and the only honest thing to do once you've reached the boundary is to acknowledge it. Zen Buddhism took a different approach to the same problem. Where Pseudo-Dionysius ascended through progressive negation, Zen doesn't ascend at all. It ambushes you. Koan's paradoxical riddles given by a master to a student, designed not to be solved but to break something. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your face before your parents were born? A man hangs over a cliff by his teeth, holding onto a branch. Someone below asks him the meaning of Zen. If he opens his mouth to answer, he falls. If he stays silent, he fails the questioner. What does he do? There's no correct answer. That's not the point. The point is what happens in the mind when it encounters a question that language can't resolve. The koan creates a kind of controlled linguistic failure, a deliberate short circuit in the rational machinery that processes words and meanings and logical relationships. You can't think your way out of a koan. The harder you try, the more stuck you get. And at some point, this is the theory anyway, and it's a theory tested across centuries of practice. Something snaps, not breaks, snaps into a different mode. The rational mind, exhausted by the impossibility of the task, lets go. And in that letting go, in that moment of linguistic failure, something else comes through, direct experience, unmediated, beyond words, not a mystical vision necessarily. Sometimes it's described as something much simpler, seeing a leaf, hearing water. Feeling the weight of your own body in a chair, but seeing, hearing, feeling without the overlay of language, without the interpretive machinery running, just the thing itself as it is. Wittgenstein's ladder and the Zen koan are doing the same work from opposite ends. The ladder builds you up and then asks you to climb beyond it. The koan pulls the ground out from under you and asks you to notice that you're still standing. And then there's Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, Sufi mystic, whose approach to the limits of language was neither logical construction nor paradoxical deconstruction, but something else entirely. Beauty. Rumi wrote about silence not as the absence of speech, but as its source. The place where words come from, the well they're drawn up from, the ground they grow out of. Every poem, in Rumi's understanding, is a finger pointing past itself toward what it can never contain. The poem doesn't capture the experience. The poem gestures. It lines in a direction. It creates an opening, a space, a resonance. And in that resonance, if you're listening, really listening, the way Wittgenstein listened to Beethoven quartets, something shows itself. Poetry for Rumi was not an attempt to say the unsayable. It was an acknowledgement that the unsayable is already present, already manifest, already showing itself in every moment of genuine attention. The poem doesn't bring you to God. It reminds you that God, or whatever word you want to use for the thing that exceeds all words, is already here, has always been here. The silence was never empty. These traditions didn't know about each other, mostly. Layazi and Pseudo-Dionysius and the Zen masters and Rumi, different centuries, different continents, different languages, different frameworks for understanding reality, and yet they all arrived at the same place, the same boundary, the same silence. Wittgenstein, coming from the direction of modern logic with his decimal numbering and his truth tables and his Cambridge education, walked the same road to the same edge. The tools were different. The view was the same, which might tell us something about the boundary itself. If this many people, across this much time, using this many different methods, all end up in the same place, then maybe the limit of language isn't a feature of any particular language or any particular philosophical system or any particular cultural tradition. Maybe it's a feature of language itself, a structural fact about what words can do and what they can't, as real as the eye's inability to see itself. As universal as the experience of wonder at existence. The roads are many, the silence is one. The ancient traditions pointed at the boundary from the outside, through theology, through paradox, through poetry. The modern world has been bumping into it from the inside, using the tools of science and philosophy and art, and finding the same wall. Thomas Nagel published a paper in 1974 with one of the best titles in the history of philosophy, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question sounds whimsical. It isn't. Nagel was after something very specific and very serious about the limits of what language and science can capture. Here's the setup. Bats navigate by echolocation. They emit high-frequency sounds and build a picture of the world from the echoes that bounce back. We know a great deal about how this works, the frequencies, the neural pathways, the behavioral responses, the way different surfaces create different echo signatures. We can describe the physics of echolocation in enormous detail. We can map the bat's brain. We can predict what a bat will do in a given situation based on the echoes it receives. And none of that tells you what it's like to be a bat. Not what a bat does, what it's like, the subjective experience, the felt quality of perceiving the world through sound echoes rather than light. There's something it's like to be a bat. Nagel assumed this, and it seems reasonable, some inner experience that accompanies the echolocation, some way the world shows up from the bat's perspective, and no amount of physical information can give you access to it. You could know every single physical fact about bat sonar, every neuron, every wavelength, every behavioral correlation, and you'd still be on the outside. You'd know everything about how echolocation works without knowing what it feels like to echolocate. The experience itself is permanently unsayable, not because we haven't developed the right vocabulary and not because bat neuroscience isn't advanced enough. Because subjective experience, what philosophers call qualia, the felt quality of consciousness, is the kind of thing that can only be had, not described. You can say what red light is electromagnetic radiation at approximately 700 nanometers. You can say what happens in the brain when someone sees red activation in V4 signal processing in the visual cortex, but you cannot say what red looks like. The looking is private. The sentence can't get there. Wittgenstein would have recognized this immediately. Proposition 6.522 again. There are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. The experience of echolocation makes itself manifest to the bat. It shows itself in every moment of the bat's conscious life, but it can't be said, not by the bat who lacks language and not by us who lack the experience. Frank Jackson pushed this further in 1982 with a thought experiment called Mary's Room. It goes like this. Mary is a brilliant scientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She's never seen color, but she has, through extensive study, learned absolutely everything there is to know about the physics and neuroscience of color vision. She knows which wavelengths stimulate which receptors. She knows how the brain processes color information. She knows the evolutionary reasons we see color the way we do. She has, as far as physical science is concerned, complete knowledge of what color is and how it works. Then one day she leaves the room and she sees red. Does she learn something new? Jackson argued yes, obviously yes. Whatever she gains in that moment, the experience of redness, the felt quality of seeing a color for the first time, it's something that all her scientific knowledge didn't include. Something that couldn't be communicated to her through any description, no matter how thorough. Not because the descriptions were incomplete, but because descriptions are the wrong kind of thing. Experiential knowledge, knowing what red looks like from the inside, is not the kind of knowledge that language can transmit. You have to have it. It has to be shown to you by the experience itself. There are philosophers who dispute this conclusion. Some argue that Mary doesn't learn a new fact but gains a new ability, the ability to recognize red. Others argue that if she truly knew all the physical facts, she'd already know what red looks like because subjective experience is identical to physical brain states. The debate has been going for decades and shows no signs of resolution, which might itself be evidence that the territory is genuinely unsayable. Even the argument about whether it's unsayable can't be settled in words. Neuroscience, for its part, has been quietly confirming something that fits this picture. There's a measurable gap, an information bottleneck, between the richness of conscious experience and the capacity of language to capture it. At any given moment, your brain is processing vastly more information than you could ever put into words. The texture of the air on your skin, the specific quality of the light in the room, the complex emotional state you're in that's not quite happy and not quite sad but something that doesn't have a name, all of this is real, present, experienced, and largely inexpressible. Conscious experience vastly exceeds language's bandwidth. The unsayable isn't a rare thing you encounter at philosophical extremes. It's the normal condition. It's most of what your life actually consists of, moment to moment. Every second of your experience is mostly unsayable. You live in the part of the world that language can't reach. You always have. You just don't usually notice, because language is so good at creating the illusion that it covers everything. John Cage noticed, in 1952, 1 year before the Philosophical Investigations was published, 1 year before Bachmann's essay triggered the Wittgenstein Renaissance, Cage performed a piece called 433. A pianist walked onto the stage, sat down at the piano, opened the lid, and then sat there without playing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. 3 movements, each marked tacit, the musical instruction meaning be silent. The pianist turned the pages of the score. There was a score blank but formatted correctly. The movements were timed, and at the end the pianist closed the lid and left the stage. The audience was furious, or confused, or amused, or in some cases something else, something harder to name. Because what 433 does is this: by removing the music, it reveals everything the music usually drowns out. The coughing, the shuffling, the rain on the roof, it was raining at the premiere, the rustle of programs, the sounds of the audience's own bodies, breathing, swallowing, the barely audible hum of being alive in a room. Sounds that are always there but never heard, because music fills the space where they would otherwise be. Proposition 7 at the piano, the musical equivalent of whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Cage's silence isn't empty, it's full of everything that's usually masked by the thing you're paying attention to, the unsayable revealed by the removal of the said, and the experience of sitting in that room, hearing rain and breathing and the creak of a piano bench with no one playing. That experience is something no review of the performance could ever capture. You had to be there. It had to show itself. Rilke understood this too from the other direction. In 1922, the same year the Tractatus was published in English, Rainer Maria Rilke completed his Duino Elegies, the great cycle of poems he'd been working on for a decade, and in the 9th elegy he arrived at a conclusion that sounds, at first, like the opposite of Wittgenstein's. Where Wittgenstein said the most important things can't be put into words, Rilke said that putting things into words might be exactly what we're here for. That perhaps we exist in order to say the simplest things: house, bridge, fountain, gate. But it's not really the opposite. Look closer. Rilke isn't saying that language captures everything. He's saying that language's highest purpose, the thing it does best, the thing it was made for, is the humble, specific, concrete nomming of ordinary things, not abstractions, not grand philosophical systems, not explanations of how the world works, just house, bridge, fountain, gate, the simple words that honor the ordinary by noticing it, by saying quietly, this exists, this is here, I saw it. And this is the part that connects to Wittgenstein, the act of nomming is also an act of vanishing. The word house isn't the house. The word calls up the house and then dissolves, leaving the experience, the weight and warmth and shelter of a house, the feel of standing inside one on a cold night, to show itself. Language at its best is a finger pointing, and the point is never the finger. Rilke and Wittgenstein, writing at the same moment in history, from opposite directions, one a poet, one a logician, both arrived at the insight that language's deepest truth is about what it can't hold. The poet said, we are here to say the simplest things, and in saying them to honor a world that exceeds all saying. The logician said, the world exceeds all saying, and the honest response is silence. Different temperaments, same boundary. Same quiet recognition that the things that matter most, the house in the rain, the red that Mary finally sees, the sound of breathing in a silent concert hall, can only be shown. Never said. April 29, 1951, Cambridge, England, not the university, a private house on Story's Way, the home of Wittgenstein's doctor, Edward Bevan. Wittgenstein had been living there for the last few months. He had prostate cancer. He knew he was dying. His friends visited. Mrs. Bevan, the doctor's wife, had been taking care of him. He'd been working right up to the end, or near the end, still writing, still thinking, still pushing at the problems that had occupied him for decades. The Philosophical Investigations was essentially finished, but wouldn't be published for another 2 years. He'd moved on to other things, notes on certainty, on color, on the philosophy of psychology. The mind was still running, the body was winding down. On the morning of the 29th, the day before he died, Mrs. Bevan told him that some of his friends would be arriving the next day, and Wittgenstein spoke what would be his last recorded words. "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." That was it, no philosophical summation, no final proposition, no last thought about language or logic or the boundary between the sayable and the unsayable. Just that, tell them I've had a wonderful life. His friend Norman Malcolm heard this afterward, and it bewildered him. Because Malcolm had known Wittgenstein for years. He had seen the intensity, the self-doubt, the periods of despair, the fierce unhappiness that seemed to sit at the center of Wittgenstein's character like a permanent weather system. This was a man who had contemplated suicide repeatedly, who had described himself as living in a state of near-constant inner torment, who had fled to Norway, to rural Austria, to Ireland, searching for the kind of quiet that might make the torment bearable, who drove his students to tears and then felt terrible about it, who gave away his fortune partly because he felt the weight of it as a moral burden, who subjected himself to conditions of extreme simplicity and solitude not because he enjoyed them, but because he felt he deserved nothing easier. Wonderful, this life had been wonderful. Malcolm couldn't reconcile it, and he said so later when he wrote about Wittgenstein's death. The word wonderful didn't match the life he had observed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the mismatch between the word and the observed life was the final demonstration. The philosopher Philippa Foot, reflecting on those last words, made an observation that's worth sitting with. She said the remark teaches us not to be too ready to speak of every good life as a happy life, a careful distinction. A wonderful life is not necessarily a happy one. Happiness is a feeling, a state you can point to, describe, compare to other states. I'm happy is the kind of proposition that the Tractatus would approve of. It pictures a psychological fact. But a wonderful life, a life that is, on the whole, in the final accounting, wonderful, that might be something else entirely. Something that includes suffering. Something that includes the torment and the self-doubt and the years of isolation and the impossible intensity. Something that can't be reduced to he was happy or he was unhappy, because both of those sentences, true as they might be at various moments, miss the thing that makes the whole add up to wonderful. And this is where the last words loop back to the first proposition, because what Wittgenstein was doing at the very end was the same thing the Tractatus was doing on every page. He was showing something that he couldn't say. He couldn't say what made his life wonderful. He didn't try. He didn't explain. He didn't tell Malcolm, my life was wonderful because. There was no because. No reasons offered, no list of accomplishments or relationships or experiences that added up to wonderful in some logical chain. Just the statement, bare and simple and baffling to the people who heard it. Tell them I've had a wonderful life. As if the wonderfulness was something he could see clearly from the inside, but knew he couldn't transmit. As if the most important thing about his own life, the thing that made it, in the end, worth having lived, was exactly the kind of thing that cannot be put into words. It makes itself manifest. It is what is mystical. A man who spent his whole life drawing the boundary between what language can do and what it can't, who built two revolutionary philosophies around that boundary, who ran against the walls of the cage and deeply respected the running, that man dying used his last words to show that his own deepest experience was on the unsayable side. The life was wonderful. The wonderfulness could not be said. The words, tell them I've had a wonderful life, don't explain anything. They don't picture a fact. They point. They gesture. They're a finger indicating something that the finger itself can never touch. And his friends, hearing it, felt the same confusion that readers of the Tractatus have felt for a century. They could hear the words. They could feel that the words mattered, that something real was being communicated, but they couldn't quite get to it through the words themselves. The saying fell short. It always falls short. That's what the Tractatus predicted. That's what the investigations confirmed in a different key. That's what the ancient traditions knew, and the poets and the Zen masters, and the scientists measuring the gap between experience and description. The most important things can only be shown. Wittgenstein showed them in his work, in his silence, in his Norwegian cabin accessible only by rowboat, in his whistled Beethoven, in his front row seat at cowboy movies, in his village schoolrooms and his bare Cambridge rooms and his years of impossible intensity, and at the very end in a sentence that says almost nothing and shows almost everything. Tell them I've had a wonderful life. The ladder has been climbed, you can let it go now. Whatever you're left with, this quiet, this dark, this sense that something is here that can't quite be named, that's the part that matters. The unwritten half, the music behind the silence, the thing that makes itself manifest. It's late, that's enough words for tonight. A wonderful life, not a happy one necessarily, not an easy one, but wonderful in the old sense of the word, full of wonder, full of something that resists being flattened into a summary. Wittgenstein couldn't explain it. He didn't try. He just said it and let it sit there, the way he let so many of the most important things sit unsaid, unargued, just present. Maybe that's the gentlest thing about all of this. The reminder that not everything needs to be captured. Some things just need to be felt. And if any of that gave you something to sit with tonight, we'll be here again soon with more quiet corners to wander through.